Michael McFaul's From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Michael McFaul is a figure who's written many books and has been involved in U.S. Russia and the U.S. Russia stage for basically forever. He visited the USSR twice in the 1980s, lived there, in fact, and worked for the NDI in the 90s. In the 2000s and 2010s, he worked both as a Russian strategist and then later served as the ambassador to Russia, both times working under Obama. So, for that reason, when he tells the story of how Russia and America's relationship deteriorated, it's worth listening to as he not only knows about the exchange, but witnessed it. Many critics from the more Russian isolationist or neo-realist approach go a step further and argue that he not only witnessed it, but contributed to the collapse. Whatever someone believes, it's worth hearing his side of the story, and that is exactly what his book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, gives us. Now, I'll go ahead and start by saying I think his fundamental thesis is correct. Russia did, in fact, make decisions to move towards autocracy, and these decisions were the pivotal force in the events leading up to hot peace. Um, they were in no way inevitable, and the history that McFaul shows us is how things could have been different. At the end of the day, Russia is at war with the West, not because it has to be, but because it chose to be. As McFaul notes, there were moments of cooperation between Russia and the US. Both Clinton and Yeltsin signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Both the 2008 to 2011 President of Russia, Medvedev, and Obama agreed that there should be cooperation when the interests of the two countries converged. The US supported democratic candidates and institutions in Russia's early stages. Russia also provided its air base for the US to use in its war in Afghanistan. While they debated the base in Manas, Kyrgyzstan, Medvedev permitted the US to fly in their airspace during the 2009 Afghanistan supply agreement. The Medvedev and Obama years also collaborate, in the Medvedev and Obama years, they also collaborate together in order to try to bring stability to Kyrgyzstan during the 2010 Kyrgyz revolution. And Russia also assisted in assuring that Iran didn't develop a nuclear weapon during the Iran nuclear deal. Reset and the New START Treaty further illustrate this ability to collaborate. Russia under Medvedev also wasn't afraid to condemn and blame Gaddafi for the genocide he was attempting to perpetuate. Most of these points are remarkably different from that of Putin. However, while Obama and Putin did disagree over whether or not Assad and Syria should be removed, there was some collaboration with a 2013 Syrian chemical weapons agreement. After Obama told Assad not to use chemical weapons, and he used them in 2013, Obama and Putin demanded that Assad turn over his dangerous chemical supplies, and it appeared, according to monitors, the monitors known as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that he mostly did so. That Assad turned over his weapons with pressure from Russia and from the US. In 2017, Assad used chemical weapons again, and McFaul claims Putin must have known this. But so there's a little bit of ambiguity there. But the point is, there's a lot of points of collaboration between the West and Russia. Another instance was in 2011 when the FBI and CIA John Brennan was permitted to enter into Russia by the FSB in order to investigate the witnesses to the 2011 Boston Marathon bombing, since the bombers were from Chechnya. This is perhaps one of McFaul's most controversial claims, is that he saw Medvedev as a unique reformer who was willing to compromise and work with the West. So, the conventional wisdom is and was that Medvedev was a little more than a Putin puppet. But McFaul notes points of disagreement between Medvedev as evidence to the contrary. For my money, I can't really call Medvedev a good guy. After all, he authorized the occupation of Georgia. Whether Putin ordered him to do this or whether he made this choice freely seems problematic either way. I remember reading somewhere that when I think it was Bush called Russia, Medvedev referred him to Putin to talk about the issue. Or someone in the Bush administration called Medvedev, and Medvedev gave the phone to Putin. That's just one example that would support that Medvedev was a puppet of Putin. But for his money, McFaul gives a slightly different narrative, where he saw Medvedev as a reformer who had no power under Putin's thumb. More recently, Medvedev has made inflammatory remarks towards Ukraine since the start of the 2022 invasion. He advocated for using nuclear weapons in Europe, which is crazy. I spoke to a Russian once, though, who stated that he thought Medvedev was making these remarks so as to avoid being perceived as a more moderate political choice. I'm an English teacher online, so I sometimes come in contact with people from Russia. But anyway, this one Russian um, uh, said uh, that he believed Medvedev was making these remarks so that uh, he wouldn't be seen as a more moderate opposition to Putin, so as to protect himself. He has to appear more extreme than Putin so as to protect himself from Putin's backlash. Uh, McFaul wrote this book in 2018. So McFaul wrote this book before uh, Medvedev was making these crazy nuclear weapons remarks. Back when U.S. and Russian relations were slightly better, and people thought that they could restore them, minus the Ukraine war. So it is possible that McFaul's opinion was just kind of dated when he says this about Medvedev, but still he tends to think of Medvedev as a reformer. More surprising to me personally, however, were the times when McFaul concedes that the Russians had certain points in a particular context. For example, during negotiations, it was proposed that if the US kept their defensive weapons and both sides had to remove their offensive weapons, then Russia would be at a disadvantage because Russia didn't have as good of defensive weapons as uh, McFaul does, as the US does. Numerous times in the book, McFaul says, well, the Russians had a point here, and he just sort of throws that in there, that they had a point. He also argued that his presence in the Middle Eastern negotiations confirmed Russian suspicion that the US policy towards Russia was playing a role in the Middle Eastern region. So again, he says, Russians had a point on this particular matter. Similarly, he also pointed out that some NGOs couldn't help but be political, which supports Russia's claim that NGOs were a threat to their regime. But while some were innocuous, like Perspectiva, others, like Alexeyeva's human rights organization, were often uh, uh, led by people who criticized the Kremlin. While they didn't give money to political parties, NDI and IRI worked more closely with the opposition than nationalists and communists. This is largely due to their attempts not being reciprocated, meaning Russia United didn't want to work with NDI or IRI. But it's a point that McFaul concedes. The National Endowment for Democracy funded local Russian NGOs, but didn't fund parties, nor did it take orders from the State Department, which is part of the executive branch. NED is funded by Congress. In my opinion, McFaul seems right to note the obscurity and difficulty in doing diplomacy under these conditions. But I also believe McFaul is right that in these issues, these issues don't negate Russia's overall fault in the crisis or the events leading up to the Ukrainian invasion. He seems to understand that certain things were perceived as a bad deal from the Russian perspective. But a bad deal is a bit different from being provoked to war. That really is the underlying point here. Never mind, one of the major claims by the Kremlin was not that America had political influence in Russia, that is soft power, but that they were actively using NGOs to facilitate revolution, which would be hard power. McFaul, in defense of his own career in the Obama administration, categorically denies any attempt to pick a political victor for Russia's elections. And to his credit, I don't see any evidence that he did pick a political victor. He had no say in what the NGOs did, or even what state media like Voice of America said. For what it's worth, McFaul also notes that the criticism about NATO expansion were not mentioned once during his role as Obama's ambassador or as his Russia's security advisor. They weren't mentioned while he was Obama's ambassador to Russia, or when he was Obama's Russia security advisor. Mikhail Vinitsky, in his book Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, corroborated this point that during Maidan, the phone calls between Yanukovych and Putin and the US never mentioned NATO as a factor in Ukraine's revolution. less than 20% or around 20% wanted to join NATO at the time, so it's hard to see that as being the pivotal thing that initiated the war with Ukraine. McFaul explains that in his book, the reason for this was largely that NATO was a non-starter for Ukraine. The reason for why he didn't mention it was that Ukraine was a non-starter, or that NATO was a non-starter for Ukraine, with no one pulling or pushing the strings in that direction. While other authors mentioned obscure quotes from Yeltsin going back to the 90s lamenting NATO's expansion, the prevailing position when McFaul worked for Obama was that the issue in controversy was behind them. McFaul mentioned that he personally was hopeful that Russia would be integrated in NATO once it no longer occupied Georgia or practiced what Vladislav Surkov called managed democracy. This absence of NATO dialogue suggests that while it was an issue in the 90s and 2000s, Yeltsin's opposition went ignored and was only really brought up in 2022 in order to justify the 2022 invasion. Rather, it appears that as Russia gave up on democracy, it also gave up on appealing to the West as a whole, including NATO. This leads to a different indifference and a new outlook, one where Russia saw itself as an opposition to the West as expressed in Putin's 2007 Munich Security Conference speech. In 2007, Putin was leaving office, and Medvedev appeared to show promise in the West's eyes. But Putin's return seemed to be the mark of a permanent autocracy. If Putin could just return to power, there was never any guarantee that there could be a shift in power. This was further illustrated with wide-scale perceptions of voter fraud in 2011 and the subsequent protest. While Golos, election monitoring organization, was supported by the West with grant money, according to McFaul and Golos itself, their results were independently founded. McFaul mentions that the U.S. State Department didn't think that voter fraud was any more widespread than previous elections, but with social media, smartphones, and other technology doing the taxing work, Golos made the case that Putin stole the 2011 election, and Putin blamed the West for this, even though it was his party that stole the election. The perception difference is obvious. NGOs are the work of the U.S. in Putin's eyes with their grant money, and NGOs are independent in the U.S. State Department's eyes, since they often have their own agendas. But of these views, both of these views are incompatible. While I personally think McFaul's view is the more accurate one, the issue is somewhat obfuscated by the prospective scandal of U.S. involvement. If we put the shoe on the other foot, however, the reality becomes a little more clear. For example, we know Putin interfered in the 2016 Russia campaign. Now, the extent of the scandal is debated, but what usually isn't denied is that Putin did interfere. Subsequently, it's also generally acknowledged that Trump won the 2016 election. Clyde made a remark suggesting that Trump won the election by cheating, but this didn't amount to a full overturning of our elections. Nor did it, by itself, prove collaboration between Trump and Putin, which is a much more controversial claim than just the simple claim that Russia interfered in the process. So what's my point? Simply because Russia intervened in our election process does not mean our election process was nullified or compromised to the extent where it was illegitimate. Two things can be true at once. Putin interfered in our elections, and Trump legitimately won the elections in 2016. Both those things are true. Now, if this is the case for our elections, we need to use the same logic and application to Russia. Simply because there was allegedly some interference from the West, as Putin claims, does not mean the fraud that Golos identified wasn't also real. Two things can be true at once. Election fraud in Russia was real, and the U.S. supported NGOs that pointed out this fraud. In addition to this, the U.S. may have or may not have intervened, but the hundreds of thousands of protesters who protested in response to the 2000 election fraud could not have all been CIA agents. Whatever role the West played with the NGOs, this is not a big enough role to negate the legitimacy of Russia's own protesters. Nor is it enough to assure that the Russian population, it's not enough to assure the Russian population that their own elections were not rigged. Now, in response to this, Putin shut down dissent. The U.S. had no control over this decision, just like it had no control over the protesters. For Putin to blame the U.S. for interfering is a bit ironic, as the only criticism that NGOs presented to Russian society were things that were distinctly the fault of Putin's administration. Russian state media, like Mikhail Linotyev's programming, did its best to paint McFaul in 2012, January 17th to be precise. They tried to paint him as a revolutionary. Leontiev noted correctly that McFaul used to work with the National Democratic Institute, but Leontiev also said that the National Democratic Institute had connections to special intelligence services, that he last went to Russia in 91 to 95 to foment a revolution, that he was currently trying to foment a revolution and was close friends of Navalny. He focused on the title of McFaul's book, The Unfinished Revolution, and ignored other books with names like Re-engaging Russia or Power and Purpose, U.S. Policy Towards Russia. Konstantin Edgar from the Kremlin wrote that McFaul is proof that the reset is over because they saw McFaul as a revolutionary, even though they weren't taking into account his full perspective. McFaul also recounts times that he was harassed by bystalkers. He notes people from Nashi, the pro-Russia United group that it's also on other far-right groups, not just Russia United, that would harass him. They slashed his tires and broke into the homes of his employees. He was denied security, and he was undermined routinely, where he required MFA approval by Lavrov's orders. So he describes the very difficult time that he had in Russia as an ambassador, and how he was framed as an enemy of the Russian state before he was even really given a chance to defend himself, or much less instigate a revolution. So Russia makes these accusations about the West, about the State Department, about NGOs. And here you have this guy who worked for an NGO in the early 90s and also worked for the State Department in the 2000s. And he gives a very clear perception of what it was he was doing. He was trying to work with Medvedev. He was trying to work with the Obama regime. And he was trying to find areas of mutual interest. And they did find those areas. And they did accomplish a lot of things together. Again, I don't want to say Medvedev was a good guy because of the invasion of Georgia. And also there are other decisions too that he made. But the point is, what McFaul saw as his role in the Obama regime, or the Obama administration, was to work with Russia. And yet, even with that, you can see Russia making the decision to turn against him and making the decision to challenge whatever cooperation he was offering. So, in any case, I think that the book paints a really clear picture of how it was Russia that started the hot peace, or the war, if you will. He calls this book From Cold War to Hot Peace because it was written in 2018, before Russia had instigated the full-scale invasion. This is after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass. So the invasion of the Donbass and the annexation of Crimea were part of what he considered to be a cold peace. I'm sorry, what he considered to be a hot peace. But I would argue at this point in time, we're now back into a hot war. He wrote this in 2019. And as he points here, just as Russia was at fault for instigating this hot peace, further conflict, I think Russia is also responsible for instigating this hot war. And this book tells part of that story. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe.